So there I was, Marcus Riley, the only human in a classroom full of aliens who could probably bench press a small moon, sitting in what had to be the most boring class in the entire Galactic Defense Academy. And trust me, that's saying something when you consider I'd already sat through advanced quantum mechanics for non-telepathic species and why your species probably sucks at space combat, a historical overview. The class was called Primitive Weapons and Their Historical Significance, which should have been my first clue that this was going to be a long semester. The instructor, Professor Vextar, was a Centaurian with 4 arms and the kind of attitude that screamed, "I have tenure, and I'm going to make that everyone else's problem." He stood about 7 feet tall, had skin that looked like purple leather and eyes that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. "Now, class," Vextar droned, his voice carrying that special kind of condescension reserved for professors who'd given up on life somewhere around their 3rd century of teaching. "Today, we'll be examining the quaint projectile weapons that primitive civilizations developed before they discovered proper energy-based combat systems." To my left sat Korath, a granite whose species name was apparently as creative as their conversation skills. Picture a boulder that learned to walk and occasionally grunt in what might charitably be called language. Korath was built like a mountain range and had roughly the same intellectual curiosity as sedimentary rock. Behind me, Zippy buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that made me wonder if his species had discovered caffeine and decided to make it a mandatory part of their biology. He was a buzz, which again points for originality in species naming, and looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a hummingbird and given the result severe ADHD. His compound eyes never stayed focused on one thing for more than 3 seconds. And then there was Naya, a depths dweller who somehow managed to look elegant even while breathing through the water-filled apparatus that kept her gills functional in our oxygen-rich environment. She had this unnerving habit of answering questions before they were fully asked, which either meant she was telepathic or just really good at guessing. Smart money was on telepathy. "Your assignment for today," Professor Vextar continued, clearly savoring what he thought was going to be our collective confusion, "is to demonstrate your understanding of primitive projectile weapons using only the materials available in this classroom." He gestured around the room with all 4 arms, a smug smile spreading across his face like he'd just announced that gravity was optional for the next hour. "This should be amusing," he muttered, probably thinking we couldn't hear him. "Let's see how these so-called academy cadets handle real problem-solving." I looked around the classroom, taking inventory. Standard-issue polymer desks, flexible support beams holding up the ceiling panels, synthetic cord holding the window blinds, various electronic components, and about 20 square meters of space to work with. Korath cracked his knuckles, which sounded like a landslide in miniature. Zippy's wings started vibrating with excitement. Naya just smiled in that knowing way that suggested she'd already seen how this was going to end. And me? Well, I was starting to think that maybe all those camping trips with my grandfather back on Earth were about to finally pay off. Professor Vextar strutted to the front of the class like a peacock who'd just discovered mirrors. "Before you begin your undoubtedly primitive attempts," he said, managing to pack an impressive amount of disdain into the word primitive, "allow me to educate you about the laughably simple projectile weapons that lesser species developed in their pre-civilized eras." He activated a holographic display that showed crude drawings of slings, spears, and bows. "You see, when species lack the intellectual capacity to harness proper energy weapons, they resort to these barbaric implements. Hurling rocks, sharpened sticks, and bent wood. How wonderfully quaint." His 4 eyes swept the room, lingering on me with particular smugness. "Some species," he continued, "never progressed beyond these crude tools until more advanced civilizations graciously uplifted them." Oh, this guy was really starting to get on my nerves. "Very well then," Vextar announced with theatrical flair. "Demonstrate your mastery of primitive projectile concepts. Who would like to embarrass themselves first?" Korath stood up with all the grace of a geological event. "Korath, throw rock good," he declared, which I had to admit was refreshingly honest about his capabilities. He grabbed a stylus from a nearby desk, wound up like he was pitching for the Galactic series, and hurled it at the far wall with enough force to probably register on seismic equipment. The stylus embedded itself in the wall with a satisfying thunk, creating a spiderweb of cracks in the reinforced polymer. "Adequate force," Professor Vextar said dismissively, but hardly demonstrates understanding of projectile principles. Merely brute strength applied to inappropriate materials. Zippy practically vibrated out of his seat. Ooh, my turn, my turn." His hands moved so fast they were basically a blur as he attempted to construct some sort of slingshot using his belt and what appeared to be components from his personal datapad. The result looked like something a spider might build if the spider was having a nervous breakdown. "Behold!" Zippy announced proudly, loading his contraption with an eraser. He pulled back the makeshift pouch, aimed at nothing in particular, and released. The eraser shot backward, ricocheted off the ceiling, bounced off 2 walls, and somehow managed to hit Zippy in the back of his own head. "Physics," I muttered under my breath. "It's not just a good idea, it's the law." Naya didn't even bother standing up. She simply stared at a pen lying on her desk and through what I could only assume was telekinetic manipulation, made it float gracefully through the air before gently tapping the wall. "Telekinesis is not a projectile weapon," Professor Vextar said sharply. "You said demonstrate understanding of projectile principles," Naya replied calmly. "I projected an object through space using applied force. The source of that force is irrelevant to the physics involved." Vextar's purple skin darkened to something approaching eggplant. "That is clearly cheating." "That's clearly thinking outside the box," I said, finally standing up. "But if you want a traditional projectile weapon, I can work with that." All eyes turned to me as I walked over to the nearest desk and started examining its construction. Polymer frame, flexible joints, synthetic binding materials. The support beam overhead was some kind of carbon fiber composite designed to bend rather than break under stress. "Mr. Riley," Professor Vextar said, his voice dripping with anticipation of my failure, "surely you don't intend to improve upon the attempts of species with far superior physical capabilities." I looked up from the desk I was currently dismantling. "Oh, Professor," I said with my best innocent smile, "I wouldn't dream of it." What happened next was probably going to get me kicked out of the academy, but honestly, after listening to Professor Vextar's little speech about human primitiveness, I was feeling motivated to make a point. I flipped the desk over and started working on the legs. The polymer was designed to be flexible but strong, and the joints were held together with some kind of advanced composite material that had just enough give to be useful. Perfect. "Mr. Riley?" Vextar's voice had that warning tone that professors use right before they call security. "What exactly do you think you're doing to Academy property?" "Demonstrating projectile weapon principles," I said cheerfully, snapping off one of the desk legs with a satisfying crack. "Isn't that what you asked for?" Korath leaned forward with the kind of interest usually reserved for geological formations. "Human break furniture?" "Human modify furniture," I corrected, examining the leg's natural curve. These desks were designed by someone who actually understood materials science. The polymer had memory characteristics that would work perfectly for what I had in mind. Zippy was practically bouncing in his seat. "Ooh, what are you making? Is it a club? Are you going to hit things with it? Can I help hit things?" "Patience, my hyperactive friend," I said, moving to the second desk. "Good engineering takes time." I needed about 6 feet of workable length, which meant I was going to have to join 2 desk legs together. The synthetic cord from the window blinds would work for binding, but I needed something with more tensile strength for the actual bowstring. That's when I noticed Naya watching me with those knowing eyes of hers. "You're building a bow," she said simply. Professor Vextar let out what I can only describe as a condescending chuckle. "A bow? Really, Mr. Riley? Even by primitive standards, that's remarkably basic. Surely even human engineering could aspire to something more sophisticated than bent wood and string." "Well," I said, carefully heating the polymer joints with the small plasma cutter I'd borrowed from the engineering kit, "that's where you're wrong on a couple of levels, Professor. First, this isn't wood. This is a advanced polymer composite with memory characteristics and a tensile strength that would make a lot of metals jealous. Second, the bow isn't basic at all. It's actually one of the most elegant applications of stored kinetic energy ever developed." I started working the heated polymer, bending it into the characteristic curve I needed. The material wanted to return to its original shape, which was exactly what I was counting on. "You see," I continued, working steadily while my classmates watched in growing fascination, "a bow is essentially a spring-powered projectile launcher. The energy you put into drawing the string gets stored in the bent limbs, and then released all at once when you let go. It's a perfect example of potential energy conversion." Vextar was trying to look bored, but I could see him watching my hands as I worked. "Fascinating. And I suppose you think this little craft project is going to impress us?" "Oh, I'm not trying to impress anyone," I said, beginning to notch the ends of my improvised bow stave. "I'm just following your assignment. Demonstrate understanding of projectile weapon principles using available classroom materials." I held up the partially completed bow, testing its flex. The polymer wanted to spring back, creating exactly the kind of stored energy I needed. The question is, Professor, I said, meeting his four-eyed glare with my own two-eyed smile, are you actually prepared to see what human primitiveness looks like when we put our minds to it? Professor Vexter's forearms crossed in what I could only assume was the Zentorian equivalent of, I'm about to fail a student, but I was just getting started. Let me walk you through the engineering here, I said, holding up the curved polymer stave. This isn't just bent furniture. This is a carefully calculated application of Hooke's law, elastic potential energy storage, and projectile motion dynamics. I moved to the third desk, needing more material. The polymer legs had a natural taper that was going to work beautifully for what I had in mind. See, when you bend a material within its elastic limit, I continued, applying controlled heat to join two sections together, it wants to return to its original shape. That desire to return is stored energy. The further you bend it, the more energy you store, following a nice predictable curve until you hit the material's failure point. Zippy's compound eyes were practically spinning as he tried to follow my movements. But why not just throw things harder? Karath throws very hard. Great question, my caffeinated friend, I said, testing the flexibility of my joint stave. Korath can throw hard, sure, but he can only throw as hard as his muscles can generate force in that one instant. A bow lets you take your time building up energy, storing it, and then releasing it all at once. It's force multiplication through temporal displacement. I was shaping the tips now, creating the notches where the string would sit. The polymer was cooperating beautifully, holding its new shape while maintaining that crucial spring tension. Think of it this way, I said, glancing at Naya. When you use telekinesis, you're applying force directly to an object, right? The bow lets me do something similar, except I'm borrowing energy from my muscles over time, storing it in the bent limbs, and then releasing it faster than my muscles could ever act on their own. Professor Vextar was trying to maintain his superior expression, but I could see the gears turning behind those four eyes. He was starting to realize this wasn't the crude stick-and-strain contraption he'd expected. The really clever part, I continued, moving to the window to harvest some of that synthetic cord, is the string mechanics. Most people think the string just holds the bow bent, but it's actually doing something much more sophisticated. I started braiding multiple strands of the cord together, creating something with serious tensile strength. The string doesn't stretch much, which means almost all the energy stored in the bent limbs gets transferred to the projectile. It's an incredibly efficient energy transfer system. We're talking about converting maybe 70 to 80% of the stored energy directly into kinetic energy. Korath was following along with surprising attention for a sentient rock formation. String nuts stretch, arrow go fast? Exactly right, big guy. No energy wasted on stretchy string means more energy going into launching the projectile. I was attaching the string now, carefully measuring the brace height to optimize the energy transfer. Compare that to, say, a slingshot, where the elastic pouch has to stretch and snap back. You lose a lot of energy in that process. I stepped back and held up the completed bow. It looked nothing like the crude wooden weapons in Professor Vextar's holographic display. This was a sleek, curved piece of engineering that practically hummed with stored potential energy. But here's where it gets really interesting, I said, giving the string a test pluck. The sound was sharp and clean, exactly what I wanted to hear. The bow doesn't just store and release energy, it accelerates the projectile over a distance, which means I can fine-tune the power delivery curve. I demonstrated by drawing the string back slowly, letting everyone see how the energy built up gradually. See how the resistance increases as I pull back? That's the energy storage ramping up. But when I release, I let the string snap forward without an arrow, and even empty, the bow made a sound like controlled thunder. The energy gets delivered over the entire draw length, accelerating the projectile the whole time it's in contact with the string. It's like having a very short, very powerful rocket motor. Even Naya looked impressed, and she usually knew everything before it happened. Professor Vextar cleared his throat with all the authority he could muster. This is all very educational, Mr. Riley, but I fail to see how this crude assemblage represents any significant advancement over basic projectile principles. I smiled and reached for a handful of styluses from a nearby supply drawer. Well, Professor, that's where the demonstration comes in. The styluses were going to need some modification to work as arrows. They had the right length and weight distribution, but I needed to create proper fletching for stable flight and a nock to interface with the bowstring. Arrow construction is its own science, I said, pulling out a small utility knife. Most people think you just point a stick and throw it, but there's actually a lot of aerodynamics involved. I started carefully shaving strips from one of the polymer desk surfaces, creating lightweight fins. These fletching vanes create drag at the back of the arrow, which pulls the center of pressure behind the center of mass. That makes the arrow naturally want to fly point first, even if it starts wobbling. Zippy was practically vibrating with excitement. Ooh, like my wings. They make me stable when I fly. Exactly like your wings, I confirmed, binding the improvised fletching to the stylish shaft with synthetic cord. It's the same principle that makes shuttlecocks fly straight in badminton, or why throwing darts have those feathers at the back. I cut a small notch in the back end of the stylus to create the nock where it would sit on the bowstring. The fit had to be just right. Too loose and the arrow would fall off. Too tight, and it would affect the release. Now, I said, holding up the completed arrow, for the really fun part, projectile ballistics. I moved to one end of the classroom, giving myself about 20 meters of range. On the far wall hung a motivational poster featuring some kind of inspirational alien landscape with text that probably said something like "hang in there" in 17 different galactic languages. The beauty of a properly tuned bow, I continued, nocking the arrow and beginning to draw, is that it's incredibly predictable. Once you know the bow's characteristics, you can calculate exactly where the arrow will hit based on distance, angle, and atmospheric conditions. Professor Vextar snorted dismissively. Mr. Riley, this classroom is hardly a suitable range for demonstrating accuracy with such a crude... I released. The arrow flew across the classroom in a perfect arc, the fletching stabilizing its flight as it rotated slightly around its center of mass. It struck the motivational poster dead center with a solid thunk that echoed through the suddenly silent room. The poster now had a stylus embedded exactly through the middle of what appeared to be an alien sunrise. As I was saying, I continued conversationally, nocking a second arrow, predictable ballistics. I drew again, this time aiming slightly to the left. Wind drift compensation. Release. The second arrow struck precisely 2 inches to the left of the first. Third arrow. Elevation adjustment for longer range. This one hit 2 inches above the first, forming a perfect triangle. Karath made a sound like grinding granite, which I was learning to recognize as his version of amazement. Human make arrows go where human wants arrows to go. That's the idea, big guy. I was nocking a fourth arrow now, and I could see Professor Vextar's expression shifting from smugness to something approaching concern. But the real test isn't accuracy at known range with stationary targets. I turned toward the side wall, where a small maintenance panel was blinking with status lights about 8 meters away. Much smaller target, different angle, and I'd have to compensate for the changed geometry. The human brain is remarkably good at calculating ballistic trajectories, I said, drawing the bow and taking aim. Millions of years of evolution as persistent hunters gave us an intuitive understanding of projectile physics that most species never developed. I could feel the energy stored in the bent limbs, the perfect balance point where the arrow sat on the string, the slight tremor in my drawing arm as the muscles worked to hold the bow at full draw. We didn't just throw rocks and pointy sticks, I said, my voice steady despite the 40-pound draw weight I was holding. We threw them with mathematical precision. Release. The arrow flew true, striking the maintenance panel's center status light with enough force to crack the housing. The light flickered once and went dark. The silence in the classroom was profound. Naya broke it first, her voice carrying what might have been awe. That was not primitive. That was elegant. Zippy was practically bouncing off the walls. Do it again. Hit something else. Can you hit something moving? Can you teach me to do that? But it was Professor Vextar's reaction that really caught my attention. He was staring at the bow in my hands with an expression I couldn't quite read. His forearms had uncrossed, and he seemed to be reassessing everything he thought he knew about human capabilities. Mr. Riley, he said slowly, his voice lacking its earlier condescension. Perhaps I have underestimated the sophistication of human projectile technologies. I lowered the bow and smiled. Professor, you haven't even seen what we can do when we have proper materials to work with. Professor Vextar walked slowly across the classroom, his 4 eyes examining each arrow embedded in the wall. He reached up to touch the one in the maintenance panel, testing how deeply it had penetrated the reinforced housing. 43 millimeters of penetration. Through military-grade polymer composite, he murmured, more to himself than to us. Using improvised projectiles and a weapon constructed entirely from classroom furniture. He turned back to face me, and I could see something had fundamentally shifted in his expression. The condescension was gone, replaced by what looked suspiciously like professional respect. Mr. Riley, he said carefully, I believe I owe you an apology, and perhaps a revised grade for this assignment. Zippy couldn't contain himself any longer. That was amazing. Can you teach me? Can you teach all of us? Is that why humans got accepted into the Defense Academy? Because you're all secret weapon masters? I laughed and started carefully unstringing the bow to release the tension in the limbs. Not exactly, Zippy. Though I have to admit, growing up on Earth does give you certain advantages when it comes to projectile weapons. What kind of advantages? Naya asked, her telepathic abilities apparently not extending to reading human memories. Well, I said, settling back against one of the remaining intact desks, Earth is a pretty dangerous place, evolutionarily speaking. We spent millions of years as prey animals before we figured out how to become predators. And when you're a relatively slow, weak, clawless ape trying to hunt things that are bigger, faster, and better armed than you are, you learn to get creative. I held up the improvised bow. This isn't just a weapon. It's a force multiplier that lets a 70-kilogram human take down a 300-kilogram animal from a safe distance. We didn't develop energy weapons because we didn't need to. We got really, really good at kinetic weapons instead. Korith rumbled thoughtfully. Humans hunt big things with small arrows. Humans hunt everything with whatever works, I corrected. Arrows, spears, slings, boomerangs, blowguns, crossbows, and eventually gunpowder weapons that could punch through armor. We've been in an arms race with our own environment for our entire evolutionary history. Professor Vexstar was nodding slowly, pieces apparently clicking into place. That would explain the Academy's interest in human tactical thinking. Most species develop technology to overcome environmental challenges. Humans develop technology to overcome other humans. Bingo, I said. Every weapon system we ever created was designed with one question in mind. How do we kill something that's trying to kill us first? That tends to produce some pretty effective results. I gestured around the destroyed classroom, where my improvised arrows were still embedded in various surfaces. This isn't primitive technology, Professor. This is 10,000 years of refined engineering focused on one very specific goal. Putting projectiles exactly where they need to go, when they need to get there, with enough force to solve the problem permanently. Naya was studying me with those knowing eyes again. The Academy didn't just accept humans for diversity purposes, did they? I grinned. What gave it away? The fact that you just built a functional precision weapon system out of classroom furniture in under 30 minutes while simultaneously giving us a graduate-level physics lesson, she said dryly. That's not exactly standard curriculum for most species. Professor Vexstar cleared his throat. Indeed, and I suspect, Mr. Riley, that this little demonstration is precisely why the Galactic Defense Council decided that humanity might have something valuable to contribute to our understanding of practical applications. Practical applications of what? Zippy asked, still buzzing with residual excitement. Creative problem-solving under resource constraints, I said, also known as making do with whatever you've got handy when someone's shooting at you. I stood up and handed the bow to Professor Vexstar, who accepted it with considerably more reverence than I'd expected. The thing is, Professor, calling our weapons primitive misses the point entirely. They're not primitive. They're perfected. We spent our entire developmental history refining these systems, because our lives depended on getting them right. He tested the bow's flexibility, clearly impressed by the craftsmanship. And now you're here to teach us these principles. Among other things, I said with a shrug, turns out that when you spend a few thousand years figuring out how to kill things efficiently, you develop some useful skills for keeping things alive, too. I looked around at my classmates, who were all staring at me with expressions ranging from amazement to something approaching healthy respect. Besides, I added with a grin, wait until you see what we can do with actual weapons-grade materials and a proper workshop. This was just the warm-up. Professor Vexstar looked down at his ruined classroom with its dismantled desks and arrow-riddled walls, then back at the elegant piece of engineering in his hands. Mr. Riley, he said solemnly, I believe you've just earned yourself an A+, and possibly a recommendation for advanced placement. He paused, considering the destruction around us. Though next time perhaps we should conduct your demonstrations in the armory. The maintenance department is going to have some very pointed questions about what happened to my classroom. I couldn't help but laugh. Don't worry, Professor. I'm sure they'll get the point.